Started. So, hello, Sako is here. We are excited, thrilled to talk to Michal today. The topic is building well-architected infrastructure. Michal has years of experience in that field and was really big part of building amazing infrastructures for the startup called Gladly recently. And so he has been in pretty much all over the places for QA, security, infrastructure, and it will be the cost piece, which we are getting a lot from the community, the questions, and it will be nice to hear from the person who has been actually done that. So again, once again, thanks so much, Michal, joining us today. And yeah, let's see our agenda. So our agenda, we're gonna just kick it off and we're gonna switch to also chit chat if so we feel free also write in the chat for the things you want to learn, and I think that will help Michal to better understand the expectation wise. And we really small group, and we will take it's good for you as an opportunity to know Michal better and ask more questions you have and live questions, and we may or may not take break depending on how Michal want to do that, and then we will have Q&A in the end, and we will wrap it up and go enjoy the rest of the Saturday, I guess. And people joining from different time zones, I guess, yeah, you will still have some time. It's still not that late. So again, we are now kicking, it was a while, and we are gonna call it session 1 for this new chapter. And I'm gonna be the host today because I have so many questions, so it made sense for me to ask. And here is, you see the donuts. I think there is a reason for that, Michal, because not so many people get lucky to have managers who deliver to the team the donuts in person, especially now COVID days when we don't have so many in-person meetings. So just small things, but really that make big difference. And let's, for the chit chat, again, we have the link, but again, you can, I'm gonna post it in the chat also that so yeah, you can just post it there. I see. 1 second, I think we have. So I posted in the chat. You will keep moving. So for code of conduct, it's simple. So we are here to learn, benefit, contribute, no marketing, selling, competing, and equality despite roles and background. So again, we never really had any issue with the code of conduct. It's just for the sake of saying, and but nothing new. And yeah, that's, we are moving to you, Michal. Floor is yours. I'm gonna stop sharing and let's get started.
Hey everyone, so let me know if you can see the slide here. Is the slide coming through? Perfect.
Okay.
Yep. Sweet. So thank you for the invitation, Sako. And if you'll be so kind, and I will probably not be able to monitor the chat or the chit chat. And either you or someone just interrupt me as I go and ask questions. So I wanted to share some observations from my tenure at Gladly, and you know, keep in mind opinions are of my own, and what I'll be sharing is you know, my thoughts about things around the architecture, you know, infrastructure, DevOps culture. Yeah. So again, my name is Michal. I'll be, you know, talking today, and feel free to interrupt as we go. So for the background, very quickly about what Gladly is, so you have that insight into maybe why certain things and why not. So Gladly is a customer service platform. We're building what we call a radically personal customer service, and the idea is, instead of tickets, like with some of our competition, we are based on conversations with customers. So it doesn't matter if you reach out to people over, Facebook, SMS, phone, email, chat. It will all end up being, an agent talking to you as a person, rather for every one of those to be a new ticket. And when we're talking about the scale, so I'll mention scale later, but slide of our customers, we're serving millions of these conversations every month. And when you talk to one of these, I'm wearing glasses, so I might be reaching out to Warby Parker because I want a different pair. The agent on the other side would use Gladly software to serve those requests. So for the agenda today, I have a list of topics, and these are meant to be discussion opportunities. So again, interrupt me as we go, ask questions, or if you have observations of your own, bring them up. By no means this is supposed to be a comprehensive presentation on well-architected infrastructure. It's more topics and things that I found interesting over the years working with the infrastructure team at Gladly. So for setting the scene, talking about the tech stack at Gladly, we use Go, we use React, and then we're leveraging AWS, so typical AWS services you can think of: S3, CloudFront, Aurora, persistent storage on S3. We're a heavy user of Kubernetes. For CI, we use CodeFresh. For infrastructure provisioning, we use Terraform, Spinnaker, Argo CD, GitHub, Sumo Logic. All of those, typical what you would expect in a typical modern SaaS architecture. There's also things that obviously come up, like Slack and PagerDuty, and I have my own thoughts about PagerDuty. If we have time, maybe I can share later. But the tech stack. How do you think about the tech stack? And there's this really classic, I think, post by Dan McKinley about choosing a boring technology. And I'm not going to go through this. Just find that, choose boring tech. The boring tech technology.club will come up. And I think it's a great read on the trade-offs between choosing cool and bleeding edge technology and something that's well established and already known. And for Gladly specifically, I think there has been some interesting costs of staying on bleeding edge. For example, Gladly has chosen to use Kubernetes quite a long time ago, like fairly early in the company development, so more than I think 5 or 6 years ago. The team decided to go with Kubernetes. And over time, if you look at where the companies are right now, this is probably a fairly typical approach to building infrastructure and building application architecture. But because we've made those choices fairly early on, there has been cost associated with this. So when we went with Kubernetes, there wasn't really a managed solution. So we had to manage our own Kubernetes. And of course, you do it through tools like kops. But the cost to maintain, the cost to run the Kubernetes infrastructure was there. Every time you needed to upgrade, there was basically some manual work involved. And I told you what Gladly is. Gladly is building awesome customer service software. It's not a company that our main business is not maintaining Kubernetes infrastructure. Therefore, we would very much like to delegate the maintenance of the Kubernetes infrastructure to someone else. And in this case, because we're using AWS, the obvious solution is EKS. And that cost of choosing that bleeding edge technology 5 or 6 years ago, we had to pay it in that cost to migrate to EKS. And yes, of course, it has been worth it. Similar thing happened with infrastructure provisioning. So we chose Terraform, which is probably not a really surprising choice to anyone. But that was before anything like Terraform Cloud existed. And what we found over time that we built infrastructure provisioning tools based on Terraform, but when we started growing and the team started growing and we started onboarding engineers, the feedback we've heard is that that infrastructure is confusing because it was something that was homegrown before there were really well-established standards for how you modularize your Terraform infrastructure or Terraform architecture. And we had to pay this debt, and we had to go back and rewrite and split things into well-defined modules from the Terraform perspective. And now, I think it's still, to be honest, my personal opinion is still fairly early for Terraform Cloud. I think Hashi has relatively recently launched their cloud platform, and they haven't really fully integrated all their Terraform Cloud with the HCP. But I think overall, seems like the right choice. Maybe a little early, or maybe we could have done a little bit. And then this is talking about staying on bleeding edge. The other facet here is choosing the cost of choosing a cool technology or something that someone finds really cool. And one example in our case was, if you have an engineer that really likes a specific programming language, to be honest, internally, we don't limit what developers can use for their services. We more or less gently guide people to use something that's known. I've managed Go. I've mentioned Go. I've mentioned React. So if you're writing a new service, we guide engineers to consider using those, because internally, what you'll find out is that you'll get a lot of support for your service, and if you think about maintainability of your service, you'll get a lot of support from other engineers if you choose one of the languages that's internally built. But there was a tool that someone decided to write, and because they really like this one specific language, they just went with it. And now, to be honest, we're kind of stuck because it grew to the point that it might not be worth rewriting from scratch in Go or JavaScript. And that's the cost we will probably have to pay for a while. Someone just choosing a cool programming language that is not necessarily known within the engineering team at Gladly. I've mentioned AWS, and one thing that comes up over there that we hear from the industry is multi-cloud. And that's also something that has driven us for a while, making sure we introduce these abstraction layers, because maybe we're going to switch to some other cloud. But realistically, realistically thinking, how likely is that going to happen? Like one argument that we hear is, oh, what if AWS goes down? And to be honest, yes, obviously it's part of our disaster recovery, business continuity planning. But when you start thinking, I've showed you the list of customers, there's so much dependency on the cloud these days that, to be honest, what we see is that if there is major AWS issues, most often what happens is actually Gladly is up. We're working fine because we have built a resilient infrastructure. Our customers are down. Their contact centers are down because, for example, maybe their contact center ISP relies on AWS DNS. And because there are issues, let's say, with DNS or some service provisioning, their agents really cannot, for example, log into their computers when AWS is having issues. So going back to that multi-cloud, like I would, from Gladly's perspective, it's just something that realistically does not add a lot of value to our disaster recovery and resiliency. And then I'll mention something else here when it comes to the boring technology that I found interesting, is that over time, and this is applicable to software engineering in general. I think whenever we found ourselves fighting the technology and having to write a lot of code or having to do something that was not really supported by a vendor, let's say, um, let's pick up GitHub, right? So like if we found that we're gonna have to like write a lot of things around GitHub, that typically means that could be a signal that you're doing something wrong. That maybe the approach you're taking is either not right, or maybe you should choose a different vendor for that solution. And one thing that we've been telling vendors over the years is that we would love them to be opinionated, because one thing that also came up, and this came up in terms of our CI and CD environment. So if you think about solutions like Circle CI, CodeFresh, Jenkins, is we don't want to invent everything from scratch. Like if you think about building and deploying services, all the companies in the world build and deploy services. So whenever we found ourselves that we need to write some, let's say, script for our CI infrastructure that does something obvious, like, I don't know, like build a Docker image and push it to a repository, and then, I don't know, like update some status in GitHub and deploy it, and then notify people that it has been deployed. That is something that we would love the vendors to do, because millions of companies have to write the same scripts and the same tools over and over again. So that's something that we really like to push our vendors for, and that also applies to open sources. If you're forking, if you find yourself forking an open source repository because you may be thinking that they got that tool got something wrong, I would stop and think like, hey, like, why are you forking this? Why am I forking this? Do I really need to fork? Is this something maybe that I'm doing wrong? Maybe I'm going against the flow of what the idiomatic approach is, or what is the native approach for a given tool. And we've done this internally. Like every time someone comes up to us, one of the engineers, and says like, oh, we need to fork this repo for internally, and because I need to make changes, that will always give us a pause and like think about, why are we trying to do this? Maybe we should contribute back. That's actually pretty good solution. There's actually, we've been using some open source tools for secrets management, and our initial approach was, oh, like, I think we really like this tool, but the tool doesn't do that thing, and so therefore let's fork it and like start making changes. And then one of the engineers on the team just took this pause, step back and like thought, oh, like we're doing something wrong here. We should actually take the approach that this tool does, and we've actually reworked a little bit our approach and started using that tool. So choose boring technology, but obviously not too boring. You want to innovate, you want to move forward, you want to explore new things. So one thing that we found out was really working is building that room for experimentation, building that room for failure. And if you think about cloud SaaS companies, one thing that comes to mind is the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, the landscape. It's a great resource. It's in, like, if you Google CNCF landscape, I think it's like hundreds of vendors. It's a big table of all the vendors that offer cloud native solutions. And to be honest, like, I tend to go back and review what's there, what's graduating, what's being admitted into the program, and that's definitely interesting resource for looking at stuff that's to be honest, somewhat boring because someone had to validate it. It's like these are like tools that have already done something and are already used quite widely, and things that did work out for us. So boring technology, something that's maybe less boring, is serverless. So going with Lambda and some specific use cases that really are good fit for serverless. Cloudflare as WAF, that has worked really well for us. And then one thing that I've mentioned, that we've chose Kubernetes fairly early on. that were paying some cost. The other technology that we chose fairly early on was Teleport. That's basically a pinhole access solution that leverages the zero trust principle for allowing you to access resources. So gravitational teleport, I think we've went based on a vague reference from someone 5 or 6 years ago, and that has been working really well for us in terms of accessing the Gladly infrastructure and having a secure zero trust access to resources. And especially during COVID, which I'll mention a little later on when I'll jump into talking about the culture a little bit, that has worked out really well. But at the same time, there are some technologies, and I see a comment from Avinash, yep, about Teleport. Some technologies at the same time that are maybe exciting and seem really cool, like service mesh. We actually have internal expertise, and there are people on the team that have used Istio and other service mesh technologies. But when we look at this, we actually have some process for looking at new technologies. They in specifically service mesh will not add a lot of value to what we do internally. So it sounds cool, it may be cool, but doesn't necessarily really apply, doesn't necessarily really improve our posture in terms of security and manageability of our infrastructure. So might work for you, doesn't necessarily come as something as a really high priority for Gladly to implement. Cool. So I'll spend, since I mentioned service mesh, security and compliance, spend a little time on the security and compliance topic, because that's also something that's important to us. Gladly, as you can imagine, enterprise SaaS startup dealing with customer information, and obviously the safety of the data of our customers is super important to us. And if we've been really lucky, because even though there are many drivers for security and compliance that our customers ask for, so it's business driven, so things like PCI, CCPA, GDPR, so privacy and compliance topics. We've been lucky that we had really great engineers that come from various security backgrounds. So founders of Vonto, which Vonto really invented the data loss prevention market, are co-founders of Gladly. And there's a bunch of also engineers from Vonto, so security, very security minded, especially around privacy and data leaks. People from Lookout, so another security company. And one thing that I think is thanks to having those great engineers inside is that we're building security in. It's really hard to add on later. Like it's, if you think about having to rewrite major portions of your software to add security later on, this is extremely expensive. So if you think about this concept of shifting left, I think it comes up really strongly, especially in terms of security. So building things from security perspective into the development system, things like, I don't know, third-party dependency scanning for vulnerabilities, continuous scanning of your Kubernetes infrastructure. And then, yes, you have the tail end, so like the deployment end, yes, obviously also scanning your production for security and compliance. But, what I do also want to talk here is that checklist approach to security, which we've unfortunately have seen in the past, where our PCI audits were very checklist driven, because it's easy to fall into this world where you have a list of requirements, let's say PCI DSS requirements, and it's very easy to fall in this world where you build this Excel spreadsheet with all those items, and then you just kind of like have a column that says, okay, met, unmet, and you just try to reconcile them. But this is extremely demoralizing for people, and to be honest, it's like extremely demoralizing to engineers. So if there is a way if there is a room for automation, that's something definitely we're looking into. If there is a way to leverage tools like Vanta, Drata, there's now multiple security automation startups and companies like Very Good Security. That's definitely something that should help in terms of mitigating having that checklist approach, because we, what we found over time is that we're really trying to focus on security and compliance, delivering value. So for example, each of our PCI audits, we try to add something of value to our customers or to us. And this year's, for example, the goal we had was spend 25% less time on the PCI audit, less resources than the last year's one. And we've met this goal. We've made it like really efficient to go through the PCI audit. And I think it to some extent, it will always be a drag to your team to go through PCI, and it is always like some sort of a drag for us to go through the PCI audit, because there's still this checklist approach on some extent, especially from the auditor side. But we try to get the most we can. And I'll switch a little bit to the question. So Avinash asked about whether we use the open source versus asked a question about Teleport, whether we use the open source Teleport or the enterprise and cloud offering. We use the enterprise for support reasons. And, to be honest, we've been lucky enough to be grandfathered in. So we've adopted Teleport quite a long time ago. So we have really good relationship. And it's to the point that Darren wants to join. I'll let Darren in. So we've used Teleport, great relationship with the vendor. To be fair, we were thinking about using their cloud yet. Because we've been using it for a long time, even before the cloud existed, we're still on just the enterprise version. So jumping back to my slides, and I have this line item about ping dependency. So you have you see that I'm like jumping a little bit between topics. I have these broad topics like, have principles and, choose boring technology. And then it's like, this guy says, oh, pin dependency, because that's something that's really, I found out really interesting over time. We had those internal discussions actually for a long time around how we're gonna, do we build our, let's say, Docker images, and should we, just use the latest tag, or should we just pin the patch version or not? And this has been going over and over. So one thing that I can tell you, it's very obvious to me. Pin your dependencies. It's if you think about things like SolarWinds hack, where you get attacked through your software delivery pipeline, pinning dependencies plays a role there, and validating the hashes of third-party tools plays a role. The other thing on this one might sound weird in the context of security and compliance. The question of having base images, especially for Docker and your build tools, that's another discussion we had for a while. Should we have a gladly blessed base images for Go and for other languages? And we haven't really adopted this, even though there were some voices internally that we should. And in retrospect, I think it's a right approach. So yeah, probably you should pin, and we should use our base images. Okay, Sako, we're doing good on time.
Yeah, I think we're doing awesome. Yeah.
Sweet. So now, Sako mentioned that the cost aspect of running the cloud. So I don't know what the audience experience with cloud solutions is, but for us, yes, it's important. You're on a cloud, you're going to pay someone to run that infrastructure for you. And so what I've mentioned here is the very simple cost cycle, which I think has worked for us. So the one thing that I found of really high value, Corey Quinn is a cloud economist for a company called Duckbill Group. And just follow Quinny Pig on Twitter. And yes, he Sako mentioned no ads, no marketing here. And in this context, I'll mention Corey Quinn, because he runs a company. So if you follow his Twitter, he might plug in his company. Duckbill Group is built to be paid for their services in optimizing your AWS, your cloud cost. But actually, Corey talks about very simple principles. Like what they will tell you is they'll expose a lot what they do internally for their customers. And what he says is just like, hey, like read your freaking cloud bill. Like it might sound trivial, but like that's what they do. Like for a lot of their customers, they just sit down, open up that company's bill and just like start reading line by line what everything else, what is there. And the biggest savings, what we found out, like with this approach, just sit down and monitor, and we have those, monthly meetings where we look at the cost of running our infrastructure. Just I don't know if it's surprising to anyone, but like shut down the unused services. We've had so much savings in just looking at what are we running? Do we really need it? And just shutting down the things that we don't use. And then yes, optimize, right? But obviously you'll have to think about the return on investment in optimizing. Like, is it worth spending a year of engineering efforts to save $1,000 a year? Well, probably not. But is it worth spending, maybe a month of engineering efforts to save $40,000 a month? Well, probably yes. So you something to consider there. So yeah, I highly recommend following Corey Quinn. I mean, on top of all the great suggestions around saving money, really funny, really funny stuff posted there. And then the other thing that comes up in terms of the cost optimization that I found fascinating, and I take no credit for this. This is I think Darren is on call, so I to be honest, I attribute this to him, is that evangelization bit of cost and exposing information about the cost to all the teams. If you think about the DevOps culture as a culture where people think about infrastructure and developing and delivering software across your entire company. So it's not something that just is really thrown over the wall to, let's say, your SRE team or your release team. Exposing information about the cost of running infrastructure, that has been working really well, like raising that awareness about the cost. We don't necessarily do cost attribution really well, and it's something that we are on the path, but at least that exposing the cost is interesting. And Sako shared in the chat the cube cost, which is interesting. There are now, like, actually, now that I think about this, Terraform offers some tools around actually understanding the cost as you're building your services. So that might be also something interesting. We don't leverage it yet, but might be useful. Cool. So very quickly, scale. I've again, going back to I think the third slide of my presentation, the list of customers. So you'll see there's like quite a bit of scale over there, but I think no surprises to anyone. Your scale should be tied to your business. What are your business needs in terms of the scale? What will you operate now versus a year ahead? Because there's, again, when we think about the infrastructure and well-architected infrastructure, there's obviously going to be trade-offs. And there are some trade-offs here. Like, do you really need to build an infrastructure that can support trillions of users, where in fact, for you to be a great successful company, all you need is 1,000 users, right? So it might be extreme, but something that comes to mind. And for Gladly specifically, what we found out over time is that the cost of maintaining an exact copy of production environment for our scale purposes or scale testing purposes wasn't really economically viable. And the extreme cases where we spent more on running the scale infrastructure than we did on running our production infrastructure, and we weren't really leveraging it fully. So we did, we scaled it down, and then we obviously still run scale tests. This is important, but we do them to extrapolate and estimate the impact on production, because what I truly believe in is that testing in production concept. And don't get me wrong, we make sure we deliver high quality software. So there's a ton of testing before things land in production. But, and again, it may vary, but what we found out is that trying to mimic and trying to replicate production environment is not really possible. Like you're not going to be able to maintain something that imitates 100% of what your customers do. So yes, we do a ton of testing. Obviously, we do unit tests, integration tests, bug blowouts, exploratory testing. Thinking about the shift left concept. Like yes, we test as early as often as possible as it makes sense. But in the end, the concept of testing in production, and by which I understand, the way I understand it is that you have a way to have enough monitors, have enough observability, have enough things built into your product, built into your system that allows you to see how your code behaves in production is very important. And in this context, obviously the feature flags come to mind. So we leverage feature flags heavily to test things in production. And I've mentioned observability. On observability, I don't know if it's a hot topic or not. Is the I really like Sumo Logic's takes on observability. They talk about observability serving, again, your business needs. I've mentioned scale and the business driver for scale. So again, for observability, the same, because observability, the way I think about this and the way that Sumo talks about this is should not be a goal by itself. It's more as a mean to serve what customers really care about, the uptime and availability of your services. And so, you can think about this as a code coverage. If you think about observability the way you think about your code coverage, I think it is similar, because you can have a code with 100% code coverage and still be buggy. And you can have an app with awesome observability, like perfect observability, and that can still go down and have poor availability because because observability by itself does not necessarily improve the uptime. So something to think about. And before Avinash ask a question in the chat. Before I answer, let me just wrap up here on talking about the SLOs and SLIs. Something that did not come up early. So if you think about startup like Gladly, enterprise startup, before you start getting to certain scale, it takes a time. And we haven't noticed this early, that as we're scaling, having those SLOs and SLIs defined, especially in terms of error budgets, would have been really useful. Because what we found out over time is if you don't have those, you may end up treating every interruption as all hands on deck. And extreme cases was when we had packet, like a single packet drop could have led to a pager duty. Of course, it's way past us, but there was a time where a single network drop would have fired alerts. And obviously, in scale of let's say thousands, let's say phone calls an hour, having one phone call drop is still very high availability of the service. But without SLOs and SLIs, it might be hard to understand what's the actual impact of certain interruptions. And now Avinash asked about my thoughts on chaos engineering. I would actually love to hear what you understand by chaos engineering. For us, what it means is making services resilient to interruptions in the infrastructure, and we do some of that. To be honest, we know even in our pre-production environments, we simulate interruptions. But to be honest, I feel like we should be doing more of it. I think it's a great concept. Whether we should be, I think Netflix, I guess, is like the extreme approach where they do it all the time, including their production environment. It's interesting, but at the same time, I think you have to think about talking about the trade-offs of the cost and the resources. Just by itself, interrupting your services will not add value unless you have someone that will actually watch for those results and then improve your services to be more resilient. So like, I mean, talking from startup perspective, I think, again, it's going to be a trade-off. It's for sure we do it, yes, to some extent. For sure, we should probably be doing it more, but watch out for the cost of, or actually watch out whether you will have resources to improve based on the results of your chaos engineering testing. And now that I think about this, yeah, did it come up? Yep. For example, if you're an engineer, you're writing a software, you may forget that the underlying infrastructure's uptime is not going to be like 100%, like really 100%. Like, is your database going to be 100% available? And the obvious answer is no. But as you're writing your code, it's sometimes easy to forget. Let me know, Avinash, if that answered your question, or I don't know if you want to post some, your observations on chaos engineering. I'm actually very interested in this. Okay, so switching a little bit into this, higher level of thinking about the infrastructure is someone needs to write it. So it's like the engineers write it, and thinking about productivity and velocity. I've mentioned that in the boring tech, your ability and your productivity will increase as you're mastering solutions. So if you read that boring tech manifesto, it comes up there as well. It's like you're likely to be better at a technology you use for a longer time. So you're likely to be able to deliver faster. And for example, for Gladly, what came up, and again, I'm just kind of like jumping between high level and something like quite specific. Our main backend is a monolith, and it actually helped us a lot. We could move fast. We didn't need to worry a lot about cross-service dependencies. And microservices are, from my perspective, microservices do make sense for some use cases, but there's always, I think when I think about microservices versus monolith, I think what comes up is just choose what works for you. And I think monolith made a lot of sense for Gladly when we were starting. Now maybe as we're maturing, or as we matured, makes sense to use microservices for some things. One thing for sure that did come up in the monolith was the attribution. Being able to attribute things like cost, scale, performance to specific teams in a monolith approach is harder than it is with microservices. So there are things that are easier, there are things that are harder. And then the other thing that I want to mention in the context of engineering productivity and velocity is the CI/CD. So we're an enterprise startup. Our companies are big enterprises. So if you think about us delivering that customer service software, and if you think about the amount of training those thousands of customer service agent needs, this is something that can make you step back and reconsider whether you should do continuous delivery and continuous deployment. And I think for us, the continuous delivery and deployment has worked really well. There's still some services that we deploy on this non-continuous way. It's still weekly, so it's still pretty good, to be honest, in terms of the delivery. But I've seen so many advantages of continuous delivery and deployment that I'll highly recommend this to everyone, and I think it works really well for us. And I don't know, it's like thousands of reasons, right? Like shipping bug fixes soon, being a forcing factor to improve your processes. There are things that you can do manually if you deploy even weekly. There are things that you can still do manually because the overhead might not be that much, that you will be forced to automate when you're in a continuous world. And I'd say it's typically good for you to automate stuff, and there's just benefits out of it. And obviously for enterprises, feature flags come up as something that allows you to do this, because you'll need to work with your customers. You'll need to work closely with your tech pubs, customer success support teams, and through them with your customers on on the feature releases, but your code can get deployed much more often than you'll release the feature. So when I talk about CI/CD, it's in the context of code deployments that I believe should happen as often as possible. And then feature releases, yeah, these can happen, at some other cycle. Cool. So now, I'm kind of like stepping up the ladder of like, maybe abstraction and talking about the culture. So I've mentioned that I'll talk a little bit the COVID and the remote work, and Sako mentioned the donuts. So yes, I mean, there are the advantages and disadvantages to remote work. And from my perspective, what I have seen is that there is no one thing that works for everyone. To be honest, like if you really like remote work, it might be surprising to think that there are people that really value the office work and they really want to be in the office. But I think it's like being an introvert versus being an extrovert. It's sometimes hard to understand. Like if you're an extreme introvert, it's sometimes hard to understand someone that's extremely extrovert and the other way around. So it's kind of similar. So I think it's, whatever works for you. What works for us is that we try to do quite a bit of things to kind of like bridge the remote work with, wanting and having those personal interactions. And Sako mentioned the donut delivery. So I tried to doing that. We try to do some like safe get-togethers because it really like helps gel the team. One thing that we do is we have this 24/7 Zoom. There's one team that just has 24/7 Zoom running, and you can hop in. It's like, think about this as your I don't know, water cooler or your coffee that you had in a coffee room in your office, where you can just like walk in and talk about stuff. And we actually talk about projects, the team projects, yes, but we talk about things like video games or obviously Bitcoin and all the other random topics, everything that's happening on the on Hacker News. Other things that we do is we have this thinking about donuts. We leverage this coffee meets donut bot that pairs you up with random people in the company, and this has been so fun because in the before world, you'll be able to like meet random people from your company at lunch or maybe in your coffee room or your break room. But this actually does this in this remote virtual world, and like you get paired up with a if you're an engineer, you get paired up with a random marketing person or sales, and these interactions are awesome. Like I'm sure Sako can speak to meeting Marlon and talking about Switzerland, and wow, this is something you'd never knew if you were just stuck in your own like remote pod. We do trivia, trivia nights. That's also cool, and whatever works. And then the other thing that comes up really high on my list when it comes to infrastructure is the transparency. So when we talk about the drivers for a lot of things like scale, like cost, like security, the business is a driver for a lot of those. And having a company with a transparent culture, I've really enjoyed this at Gladly because this really helps us understand the priorities. Why are we doing certain things? Why are we investing in certain areas, not the others? And for engineers, I think it's really helpful to work in, understand that their work is meaningful, and rather than being detached. I really appreciate that engineers at Gladly are very tied to the business and are really connected to the business, and that helps in terms of making sure we deliver value, we deliver things that our customers care about, we deliver things that will build the business. The other thing that I mentioned here is the swarming, which I think, again, I take very little credit for it. It's the team that has built this culture of swarming on problems rather than having these like lone individuals working on solve. And even if even if it may sound as if you could go faster alone, I'm trying to think how hard should I think it's very often a fallacy. It may seem you'll go faster alone, but then in the end, if you think about things like maintainability, avoiding the bus factor, um, it really pays off to some extent. Maybe take it a little bit slower, or actually swarm and pair up and throw more people at a specific problem, because what I have seen is this amazing cross-pollination of knowledge. People having different ideas about solving problems. It just works so well. And to be honest, in some cases, we deliberately actually do not pick up the subject matter experts to solve a specific problem. Because if someone is, let's say, maybe someone wrote a specific piece of code, this does not automatically mean that they should solve any future needs in this specific code area. Actually, maybe it's or for someone else to pick it up, so they learn that piece of code. And the last thing that I've mentioned on this slide that really worked out for us is communities of practice, especially for cross-cutting efforts. Like when you think about scale efforts, when you think about cost optimization efforts, when you think about security efforts, data engineering, or even like front-end development, really useful thing was having those communities of practice where people from different teams that feel passionate about the specific area, they meet and talk. And I think again, our Scale Club has been working really well. The cost effort, the team we have built around security and trust has been really, really successful. And then the one small thing to mention here, I mean, obviously you're going to need someone that feels passionate about the topic to drive it. So like Sako is here, passionate about building community of open source, and he's driving GUP. So something like this, but internally, I think this helps a lot. And you'll need this passionate leader to build and drive that community. This will not happen by itself, but then it's actually very worth it, especially for a culture like Gladly's that is geared towards learning, geared towards improving, geared towards giving people opportunities to own and be responsible for bigger areas of engineering. So if I think about, maybe you should always have 3 takeaways. If I think about the takeaways for my presentation is, what I have found very valuable over time is having a meaningful process, having a structure for things, for evaluating new technologies, leverage principles like the boring technology principle, zero trust principle that I mentioned. And these, I think that the meaningful process is something that is good to have, because you can measure things, you can have a structure for improvements. The other thing is, again, maybe trivial, but freaking hiring best people, the best, especially for startups, hiring the best people your money can buy, I think has been very important to me, to Gladly as a company, because how else are you gonna, how is you gonna succeed? The best people will care. The best people will build those communities of practice. They'll share knowledge. They'll improve themselves and others. And the last bit I thought about when, in the context of infrastructure, well-architected infrastructure, DevOps culture, is innovation. But innovation can mean different things to different people. It's such a broad term because, it can mean innovating in the competitive context, like, are you building features that are better than your competition? It can mean innovating in this more internal context of, like, what technology are you using? Are you using this something that's outdated or using something that's more modern. But I think in the end is that concept of iterating and having room for failures within business needs. I think that's what's really important for the innovation at the company. So yeah, so I think that sums up my presentation. I don't know. How are we doing on time, Sako?
Awesome. I think we are doing great on time. So we can see the folks. If you want to ask any live questions, feel free. If not, I will get started and you can join me. So yeah, feel free to raise your hand. Again, we do it more in informal way. So awesome. I think I have a few questions, Michal, and folks were reaching mainly once they want to move to DevOps, where they should get started. And because you have been in this hiring side, and I was lucky to go through that process. And can you a bit disclose that the process itself and the few guidelines, like where they should get started in general and to joining for companies like Gladly?
And you're talking specifically about, DevOps, what is sometimes called like being a DevOps engineer. Is that what you're asking about?
Yeah, it can be DevOps infrastructure in general to, it can be also generalized to engineering.
Shako, I'm so sorry. I have a question about your additional question that for me very interesting about next generation DevOps. I want to understand how think Michal vision next maybe 3 or 5 years future.
Yeah. So I think, Michal, you have now 2 questions. I think a bit elaborate on Vurgun what meant. You meant like, because Kubernetes, all this stuff, what's coming next along the way? What's your thought on that? Is it serverless or something else? So
yeah, I mean, we have a couple other people from Gladly here, so maybe if they want to speak up. I'm to be honest, like maybe I'm thinking mostly from Gladly's perspective. I think overall, the next years is for us would be more and more cloud native approach. So like maybe I can dive more into like specifically into serverless or other technologies, but I think choosing things that you don't have to manage by yourself, unless you are a cloud company. Maybe your business is, maybe you are AWS. So then yeah, your business is like building those services. But if you're not AWS, if you are a company like Gladly, you probably want to go for solutions that kind of eliminate the need to have a dedicated people that work on the infrastructure. So something that, choose opinionated vendors that will take away a lot of maintenance, because you don't want to spend money on like maintaining. So like, okay, this is very, very personal take, but like I think Jenkins is a poster child of this for me. The cost of running and maintaining Jenkins can easily go, even for a smaller company like Gladly, it can easily be more than one dedicated resource just to run and maintain Jenkins. And if you think about hiring a person to do this is a lot of money to spend on just maintaining Jenkins. And I think when you think about things like those, I think it speaks to what solutions you should go for. Serverless, yeah, I think it's a very, very exciting solution for the future. And not only the concept itself of like writing dedicated single purpose functions or single purpose services, but I think also in terms of what we have seen is that serverless or Fargate, those technologies are removing a need to have a lot of backend services. Like, I don't know, like I've mentioned gravitational teleport. If you're running serverless, like you don't need, like, there's no cluster you have to access and you have to maintain and you have to like manage yourself. So a lot of things just go away in the serverless world. That's exciting. The other thing that we've been poking into, kind of related to serverless, obviously in the CloudFront world, is, you know, the implementation there is the CloudFront workers. Keep in mind, like, I mean, again, I'm stating the obvious. Technology is not gonna solve your main problems. If you think technology is your problem, it's likely not. It's most likely people. So again, go back to that boring technology manifesto, and then talks about thinking that maybe technology is your issue, where in fact it's not. Other things, you know, I've mentioned service mesh. It's interesting, interesting technology, and it's interesting, interesting solutions for some things that you might internally see. Other thing, but maybe it's well established. I don't know if you think about this as a future GitOps approach to deploying services. So Argo CD. I think it's been a while for the GitOps approach to be honest, to mature. When I spoke about having opinionated vendors, I think GitOps obviously existed for a long time, but really having the vendors mature in this you know, in the GitOps world took a lot of time. And by mature, I mean having not having to write everything from scratch yourself. Still, to be honest, it's lacking in some areas. So most notably, there's a number of vendors that really don't offer any Terraform cloud support. There's vendors that, you know, I'm not sure if I want to name, but let's say in the telephony world or in the email world, that don't offer as much automation and management and APIs, that you still have to manage manually. So, you know, maybe in the context of looking forward 3 years, I would look for what your cloud provider offers and maybe try to go with this, because that's the more likely, you know, like safe and boring solution to pick. And that's why, you know, yeah, serverless comes up, because AWS Lambda, Fargate for running, you know, thin container infrastructure, those things come up. I don't know if it answers the question, but if others have thoughts, do chime in.
Yeah.
I can go back to your question, Sako.
Yes.
Yeah, does that make sense? So
Yeah.
I think if you forgot, the question was around getting into the DevOps or getting into engineering. It's a hard question, to be honest. But like, let me start with talking from the hiring manager's perspective. So when we're, you know, thinking about filling positions at Gladly, you're writing your job description, you're thinking about who to hire. It's easy, right, to take look at your needs, look at what other engineers on the team are doing, and just write this down. That's the candidate you're looking for. But in fact, what we've been deliberately doing is trying to challenge ourselves and trying to add interesting people to that learning learning culture at Gladly, and trying to look for something else. So for example, even though, you know, we try to write job descriptions in a way they talk about what we're using internally, right? They might mention, our job descriptions might mention AWS, might mention Kubernetes, but mostly in the context of, here's the technologies we use, here's what you can learn about more here. When we draft that bit about requirements, we actually try to look, you know, at things more from diversity perspective, and diversity meant in kind of broad context. So you can think about diversity from like race, gender, other perspectives, also from the experience perspective. So we're looking for people from diverse backgrounds, and I don't think it's necessarily revolutionary. I would like to probably more companies to take this approach. And what this means in the end is that we're open actually to people from, you know, really different backgrounds. And so one example I can tell you is we had a couple of years back, we had a candidate that, you know, necessarily did not have a lot of infrastructure experience, did not have a lot of DevOps experience. And the challenge the team put in front of this person was like, hey, you know, sounds like you've never heard of Kubernetes. So why don't you spend some time, let's meet in a couple of days and tell us what you've learned about the Kubernetes. And that person came back really with a deep understanding of Kubernetes, and, you know, learned a ton about Kubernetes in a short period of time. And that spoke to that like their learning abilities, their trajectory, their energy, and was obviously a great choice for Gladly, and worked out as an amazing engineer over the years that that person has been with the company. And so going back, I think if you're thinking about getting into DevOps, because that's a cool buzzword, and, you know, maybe you're going to make a lot of money, but at the same time, I would think like whether this will make you really happy. And if this is something you feel passionate about, working as a team, working with other engineers, solving problems, building and deploying services, and you're passionate about this, try to explore, maybe contribute back to open source, build your own services, play around with what's available there, and I'm sure good things will come to you. So, I wouldn't say necessarily force yourself into a specific area, but try to explore and see what really gives you joy. And I've mentioned Jenkins, right? So it could as well be Jenkins. Maybe you really like, Groovy, and you really like that you really like something like Jenkins. That's fine, actually. That's totally fine. But for example, you might not be happy at Gladly because that's not the culture we have, and that's not something we try to look at a lot of things from business perspective. But it's not wrong. It's just different. So again, I don't know if this answers your question, Sako. But the way I think about this is this: just do something that you feel passionate about, and don't try to force yourself into the career that doesn't seem exciting to you.
Awesome. So next question, I think probably a bit also follow up in a way that there are so many in DevOps tooling, and when you look at it, and it's becoming harder, specialize on one. And so when you look at that, how you see picking up, and the best way you really making the choice between, it can be also between the vendor, from picking the vendor, it could be the open source project itself.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, right? It's like to be honest, there's so much marketing and so much, I think, snake oil is the phrase. It's insane. Like every company especially in the DevOps market, is gonna solve all your needs, including world hunger and everything. So I've mentioned in my presentation, having a structure for this I think it's important. So having some process for evaluating technologies, I think that's important for trying things out. Understanding what business need. Is there even a business need for such and such tool internally? And how will a specific tool help you solve your business need? And can be external, could be internal business need, but overall, how will it solve it? Having some structure for evaluating alternatives, I think it's useful as well. The trade-offs, the cost, cost of switching from your current technology to the new technology, I think this comes up. In terms of maturity, again, my personal opinion, but something that I think has worked over time, I feel like open source rather than something that's vendor specific has been working well. And I think CodeFresh comes to mind over there. CodeFresh made a bet early on to leverage the best in class open source frameworks. So Helm, Kubernetes, so native integration with best in class open source frameworks. And I think that has been working out well. Rather than, if you think specifically about CodeFresh CI/CD, the alternative would be something that's really close sourced. The cost of picking something that's closed source might be higher than contributing back to the open source community, or dealing with the fact that open source might be lacking in documentation. That's like standard thing with open source. There's no documentation ever. There's no best practices, or it's hard to find best practices. But again, these are trade-offs. Trade-offs you'll have to take. You'll have to make trade-offs. You'll have to make. Did that answer your question, Sako?
Yes, it does. And I think, as you mentioned, there are so much marketing piece coming up, and even in open source, you see companies trying also get control over even it's open source and kind of lean towards more that. So it's unfortunately it's also happening. We see that, but definitely backed up is open source project in infrastructure piece. They're really getting far longer. So Darren, I want you turn your microphone and
yeah, there you go. Yeah, Darren will be definitely better.
Help me ask a tough question. I think Andrew, you too.
I don't know if Darren wants to come on the, but if you read what Darren wrote in the comment, I think it's a great take on choosing technologies and tools.
Yep. And Michal, the follow-up question would be, because in early stage when you start, and if you let's say if you start from scratch, let's say for the security, because if you call the security, it's more general terms. What would be like as a framework would you build? Because it's
to be honest, might sound, and don't I'm trying not to sound like too condescending or trivializing, but like for SaaS companies, SOC 2. What I have read over time from founders, from what I see in the industry, if you're building a SaaS startup, go with SOC 2 from the start. Because even though I've talked a lot about like business needs and stuff, this is almost guaranteed to be a business need sooner or later. Actually, probably if you're selling to enterprise customers, it will be almost immediately a requirement to be a SOC 2 compliant. So building your infrastructure with SOC 2 in mind from security and compliance will actually make your life easier over time, will streamline your sales, will, if you build it in from the start, it will make your development efforts easier. And so, yeah, that's what I would do. And then when you talk about, when I've mentioned the security and compliance, automation solutions like Drata, Vanta, VGS, Control, and Leica, these come up as something that when you're adopting SOC 2, just go with those, because these will automate a lot of things from you, take away all the checklist stuff. And if you build it in early on and drive towards SOC 2, that will make everything easier later on.
I think one more would be regarding getting vendor locked in the cloud version.
Yeah.
Do you see, what's the trade-off you see there?
Let me try to, like, what can I say? Okay, let me answer it this way. So like, there's two things I have heard. I'm curious, like, if there's more that you heard, or maybe interested in your perspective. Two things that I've heard from the cloud vendor lock-in, other than the, just the lock-in itself. One is the the multi-cloud, which I covered, what are you going to do if AWS goes down? Well, yeah, if AWS goes down, all your customers are down anyways. They cannot access anything, so you're covered there. Or like, I think the same would apply to GCP or Azure. I'm trying to remember, like when ADFS went down the other year, like everyone in the world went down. Like you couldn't log into anything. So yeah, I mean, so there are gladly competitors that tout that they are built for multi-cloud and they have all their services running on GCP, Azure, and AWS. And therefore, their uptime is 100%. Like, I mean, fair, but like if you think about the cost of running this and really the business value of this, I'll be interested into looking deeper into this, like whether this really makes sense, and whether they're really sure that there is not this one single service that actually everything else relies on, that is running on this one cloud infrastructure only. The other thing I've heard when it comes to vendor locking, so I've mentioned two things. The other thing I've heard is kind of interesting because AWS or let's say Azure or Oracle Cloud or IBM Cloud can be something seen as point of contention for your customers. So imagine you're trying to sell, let's say you're running on Google Cloud. You're trying to sell to a customer that is competing with Google. Like maybe they run their own search engine. And so from their perspective, it might be a competition thing because they now will be paying to a vendor that in the end is paying Google to run their infrastructure. But over time, and we've heard those things early on in the Gladly's history, like what companies realize over time that this does not really make a lot of sense to actually block themselves from buying from companies just on the ground of them using a specific cloud provider. So that went away over time, I think. So two reasons I mentioned, and they multi-cloud is interesting, but I would still look at it as a, does your business really need it? Like really need it? I'm sure there are some use cases that validate this, but like I would look at the cost of running writing your infrastructure to be able to switch, and how realistically it is that you ever will, and how much it will cost for you to switch. Hopefully that answers your question, Sako, but let me know if you,
Yeah, I think it covers. So now we talked about a bit security and the cloud piece, and how about the quality assurance? Because you build that expertise also, if you look at from the framework perspective and the collaboration with developers and in organization where it's usually in early stages where this lands up, and what's kind of interface between DevOps team, the let's say developers, and
yeah, and my background is in QA, and I've seen both, right? I've seen companies where you had like a very dedicated big QA team, and I've run QA organization in the past where you had this team of people that was specifically responsible for the quality of the code released. But now what I have seen over time is that if you have a dedicated QA team that's responsible for the quality of the code release, and there's not that same engineers that write the code that is getting released, you have a mismatch of interest, because you have now, your QA team that is responsible for the quality of the release. They're not responsible for the quality of the, like they're responsible for the quality of the release, but they don't write the code. So what you might end up with, and when I was running this organization, that's something that I had actually quite actively fight, is that throwing over the wall aspect of this approach, where for engineers that write the code, they don't have a direct incentive to release high quality code, because there's this other team that will be responsible for it. And for the team that's responsible for releasing high quality code, the incentive is actually not to release. because if you release something that's buggy, you get punished. But if you don't, it's okay actually. So there is a mismatch of incentives. So what I really like about Gladly is that the ownership, the teams itself, the engineering teams are responsible for the quality of their code, and then that applies to infrastructure team itself as well. The platform team at Gladly, the engineers that write the code are responsible for the quality. And we do heavily leverage the learning and retrospectives and trying to have those blameless retrospectives that help us learn from the failures. That like if we fail, if something fails and we don't learn from it, that's bad. But if something fails and at least you learn from it and you improve, that's great. And building that incentives for teams that write code to be responsible for the quality and being incentivized to keep improving, I think that has been working really well. At the same time, I think it does pay off to have someone that acts as a subject matter expert. And I talked about those communities of practice, right? So I've talked about, community of practice for scale, community of practice for cost. It does make sense to have this community of practice for quality as well. And having someone that is passionate about like, hey, I really care about releasing like really high quality code and meeting and trying to iterate and trying to improve. In our case, it's actually, there's multiple people that are interested in like really high quality code. And some of them are in engineering, some of them are actually in support. And there is a community of like, there's a meaning for quality as well, to keep improving, but making sure that like going back to your question, making sure the incentives are put in the right place. So the responsibility and ownership of quality to be with the people that are actually writing the code.
Awesome. Thanks, Michal. I think we are coming to the end. Just wanted to one more time make sure that no questions left. Again, we're gonna share in a bit the Michal's details, so feel free to reach out. And once again, we will also put recording available in our YouTube. So, and it's definitely gonna be as a reference if you are getting started or wanna look at how build your infrastructure or your application that well architected. Definitely there are so many technologies, so many things, so many trade-offs. There is really, it's hard to say right or wrong when picking technology. It's depending on the use case, but definitely having some experienced person around, I think that will definitely help you mentor. So thanks so much, Michal. Anything you wanna as a wrap it up, and anything you left you wanna?
Thank you for the invitation. I you can definitely say there's stuff there that I feel very passionate about. Thanks for the opportunity. Twitter, LinkedIn, yeah, and hopefully it covered what you are looking for, Sako, and your viewers. So thank you.
Yeah, definitely. It's especially for the Saturday morning, and I hope you enjoyed as well, Michal. And thank you, really. It was a short notice time, and definitely within that short time we made it. I think it was good kickstart. And thank you for the team, Darren, Andrew, joining, not letting us just be from the Gladly side. It's appreciated, and for the folks joining. And yeah, thank you. I will just quickly, it's gopass.com. We have a Slack, and we always, if you are volunteering, if you want to do for the events we usually do over the weekend, and trying to as much bring the industry leaders who actually done or doing stuff that will also help you ask specific questions, because asking Google, there are so many things coming. It's especially if you don't have that expertise yet, it's becoming more time consuming to make research. So that's the main purpose, again, to make friends and have some fun. So that was a whole thing. Again, it's what early Michal strongly emphasized about diversity culture. So building culture, people first culture and then product is what I have seen also, that it becomes more in the long run and more healthy. And definitely for so much open source project getting used and just pushing back these kind of things that we think blessed. So once again, thank you so much, Michal, and see you around.
Yeah, enjoy your Saturday.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. Oh,
Thank
bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.